Thanks for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. And before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on the social medias, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and our YouTube channel as well. Tonight, we're excited to welcome William Neuman in conversation with Marc Cooper. Today, Venezuela is a country of perpetual crisis, a country of rolling blackouts, nearly worthless currency, uncertain supply of water and food, and extreme poverty. In the same land where oil sits so close to the surface that it bubbles from the ground, where gold and other mineral resources are abundant, and where the government spends billions of dollars on public projects that go abandoned, the supermarket shelves are bare and the hospitals have no medicine. Venezuela's collapse affects all of Latin America, as well as the United States and the international community. Republicans like to point to Venezuela as the perfect example of the emptiness of socialism, but it is a better model for something else, the destructive potential of charismatic populist leadership. Hugo Chavez's ascent was a precursor to the emergence of strongmen that can now be seen all over the world. And the success of the corrupt economy he established only lasted while oil sold for over $100 a barrel. Things are never so bad that they can't get worse is a fluid combination of journalism, memoir, and history that chronicles Venezuela's tragic journey from petro-riches to poverty. Author William Neuman witnessed it all firsthand while living in Caracas and serving as the New York Times Andes Region Bureau Chief. His new book paints a riveting and highly personal portrait of the crisis unfolding in real time, and it also offers a heartfelt reflection of the country's great beauty and vibrancy, and the energy, passion, and humor of its people, even under the most challenging circumstances. Neuman will be joined in conversation by Marc Cooper, the award-winning journalist and the author of books such as Pinochet and Me. This event will also include an audience Q&A. Please use that Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question at any time. And perhaps most importantly, please support William and Powell by purchasing copies of Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse from us. A link to buy that book, as well as a link to buy Marc's books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. William, Marc, we're so happy that you could join us tonight. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Looks like
there we go. Thank you, Kevin. And I want to say hi, Willie. I want to say a few words to the audience about how I'm going to proceed. A couple of disclaimers. One, William Neuman is known to me as Willie. I think that's his preferred name in any case. But the disclaimer is I've known Willie for almost 40 years, 35 or so. And we are good friends. We spent some time together, even in Latin America. And so I don't come at this objectively, I come at it honestly. And it's a really good book. And I'm going to try and have a good discussion with Willie now about Venezuela, but leave parts of the book untouched or just referred to so that you have a good reason to buy it. I will just say, I have read every major book on Venezuela. This one is completely different because this book does not look at abstract ideologies, but looks at the reality on the ground and is reported in full, as Willie has deployed all of his talents on it. And it's a book that really comes alive to tell you what that situation is like. So those are my biases going into this. Willie, great book. Let me ask you this question. I think Kevin sort of hinted at it in the introduction, but I'll let you flesh it out. Yes, Republicans, and not only Republicans, even some Democrats, many Democrats, hold up Venezuela as a model for what not should be done, that it's a socialist or communist hell, and proves the bankruptcy of socialism, according to them. On the left, there are some people in America who have the opposite view and look at Venezuela as some great model of social change, as a heroic David against the Goliath of the United States, and in my opinion, kind of turn their eye away from some of the more distasteful things. How would you sum it up, Willie?
Well, first off, I want to say thanks to Marc for being here. It's a real, it means the world to me to be able to be here on this space with him because of our friendship. And Marc was one of the first people I met who was, well, I sort of learned the journalism racket from Marc. So thanks, Marc. And thank you for what you said about the book. That means a lot to me coming from you. So Venezuela and socialism. Essentially what I say, having lived there, is that Venezuela is not and never has been a socialist country. Socialism was a form of branding for Chavez and continues to be today for Maduro. What do I mean by that? Chavez wasn't a socialist. There was never any, I mean, we could talk all night about what is socialism and what are the different kinds of socialism, but there was never any serious attempt to turn Venezuela into some kind of, command economy. There was never, it was always a market-oriented capitalist country and economy.
I think what the defenders of Chavez say is, well, he took all that oil money. Because when he came in, I think when he came in, in 1998, oil started to boom, went up to $100, $120 a barrel after it'd been previously that decade as low as $8 or $10 a barrel. And with the biggest oil reserve in the world, Venezuela was raking in the petro bucks.
Right.
Didn't Chavez use those to help the poor people of Venezuela?
Well, yes, up to a point. I mean, the thing is that Chavez comes in, he gets elected in 98, he comes in to office in 99. The price of oil is under $8 a barrel at that point. It gets up to approximately $120 a barrel while Chavez is president. And people like to say that Chavez had charisma. What Chavez had was a ton of money because the oil was that high. And the whole country filled up with money. Now, previous governments had always had social programs, but Chavez gets elected after 2 decades of economic stagnation in Venezuela. So there was no money to spend. And so Chavez comes in and he starts throwing money at things and he creates all sorts of social programs. The problem is that they were, all of them, badly managed, badly thought out. And what Chavez was, he wasn't a socialist, he was a populist. We were talking about this before we started. Chavez and Trump are very similar. They're both these sort of charismatic style populist demagogues. And so Chavez, pardon?
No, go ahead, Will.
No, so he creates all these programs, but what populists do is, rather than wanting to govern to make things better, they want to govern to stay in power. And so it was more important to create lots of programs so there would be the appearance of helping people. And some people were certainly helped. They built thousands and thousands of housing units. Many of them were so poorly built that, for instance, I've been to lots of housing units built by the government, 14-story apartment towers where the elevators never work because every time it rains, the basement floods and the elevator stops working. There's no water, the electricity's bad, etc. All sorts of, they created medical schools where the students graduating couldn't practice medicine because they hadn't learned, sufficiently what they needed to learn, all sorts of things like that. So there's a huge amount of waste. And essentially what I say about Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro is that it rained money. They took all that money, they spent it, they wasted it, they stole billions of dollars of it, and then it stopped raining. And they hadn't saved a penny. They didn't save a single penny during all those years, and the money ran out.
Stop raining, by that you mean the decline in oil price, right?
Right, there were 2 crises in Venezuela. Chavez dies in 2013, and that starts this political crisis where there's this sort of, vacuum in power, which Maduro very slowly fills when he becomes president. And then a year later, the price of oil starts to fall. And that creates the economic crisis. So you had these 2 crises joined together. and they had no money.
You describe a country that's literally littered with unfinished projects, with big holes in the ground, with skeleton frames of buildings. One project you described was actually completed. I think it was a 3/4 mile railway from one slum up to the top of the slum, and it cost a couple $1 billion or more. I mean, it's some fantastic sum. Why are all? Let me just move this along by saying all these unfinished projects that you see, is that a result of terrible planning? Is it a result of corruption, that the money just disappeared halfway through the project, or what happened?
It's a result of both of those things. It's bad management, bad planning. In other words, to have, to create a railway, it needs to go somewhere. But in the project that you're talking about, it didn't even go to the top of the slum. That at least it would have been good for somebody. It went 3 stops and went nowhere. And it was created because in this slum called Petare, which a lot of people call the biggest slum in Latin America, it was a Chavista stronghold. And then suddenly the opposition mayor, mayoral candidate won the vote in that neighborhood. And so they needed to, it's pork. I mean, it's just like in this country, there's pork all the time. But in this case, they did a pork project that went nowhere. We've seen that also. But then it's so badly managed and the cost overruns, and there's all sorts of, with all these projects, the bribe money is built into the cost. So, the contractor raises the cost so that he can pay off the kickbacks to the government people who give him the contract. And that happened over and over and over again. And all those billions of dollars that went into that country during the oil boom, which was much bigger than the oil boom of the 70s, it just evaporated. With there's nothing sustainable about it. I mean, if you want to talk about socialism, then you could say, socialism would be a bunch of social programs that help people and continue to help people. But in the case of Venezuela, there was a bunch of social programs, the money was wasted, and at the end of the day, the poor people were worse off than when the whole thing started.
You quote one official or former official saying that about Maduro, who succeeded Chavez. You quote him saying that Maduro only knows tactics, not strategy, that he doesn't plan anything. Was that also true with Chavez, or was he more visionary who actually had a plan?
When you've got all that money, you don't really need a strategy. but also, what Venezuelans themselves would say is really a Venezuelan characteristic, because what you have is Venezuela is this country that since the early part of the 20th century was an oil producing country. And so it always had this bonanza mentality. And when you've got money to spend, you don't need to really plan ahead. And that's very, the whole idea of instant gratification related to this sort of form of thinking that comes out of oil riches, where I don't actually have to work. All I got to do is poke a hole in the ground and out comes the oil, is very characteristic of Venezuela. And Venezuelans talk about it and see that in themselves.
There's undoubtedly some people listening now who I'm going to take a wild guess, and they're saying, "Oh well, this is here's the view of a typical elitist New York Times guy, goes in there and says, oh, this economy's all screwed up," and he doesn't take into consideration that from the beginning, Chavez faced the hostility of the United States, who took, as one of our listeners, David Neustadt, has written in now, the U.S. certainly took the claim of socialism seriously, and acted accordingly based on its long-time policies in the hemisphere. 2 questions in one. Did Chavez get a bum rap, a bad shake, because if the United States was not fooling around with him, he would have done better? And how would you characterize the U.S. Response to him, at least initially?
Well, first off, hello to David. And second, Chavez, it's interesting because Chavez comes in and the US doesn't quite know what to make of him, but the initial reaction wasn't tremendously hostile. There's a coup against Chavez in 2002 that lasts 3 days, and then he comes back into power. And there's always a lot of question of what the US involvement was, how much the US knew. People that I've interviewed and other evidence that's come out, nothing shows that the US orchestrated that coup. But once it happened, the White House came out and they were very pleased about it. And of course, Chavez comes back in a few days. And Chavez always blamed the US for that. And he became more radicalized after that, not necessarily because of his sense of the US involvement, but just because he, was reacting to this context at home. There's a period of time when the US approach to Chavez was to ignore him. And Chavez, in a way, didn't need the US because, he had all that oil money. And also, even as he and the US were butting heads and he was, trying to bait George Bush, calling him the devil and that sort of thing, he was selling oil to the US. And so there was always an oil trade going on. And the US for a long time was the main buyer of Venezuelan oil. And Venezuelan oil was a significant portion of US oil imports. And that only changes recently. Now, more recently, it's a completely different equation. Chavez dies, and then Maduro comes in and starts to become much more repressive because A, he doesn't have the money, and B, because he's on this very uncertain political terrain, because he's not Chavez, he doesn't have the charisma, and he starts to crack down. And then the US under Obama starts to put individual sanctions on some people close to Maduro. But it isn't until Trump comes in and the US does these generalized sanctions. And then ultimately they do the oil embargo, which is now in the news because all of a sudden,
Well, right. In the news, we see that oil is back up to $100 or more a barrel, which is going to mean a lot of money for Venezuela.
Well, thanks to Putin. Let me just say to David, it's true that the US took Chavez's claims of socialism seriously, but it doesn't mean that people in the US government understood that what was going on in Venezuela. And it's also, there's a lot of people in both the Republican and the Democratic Party. I mean, essentially, Venezuela has become the new Cuba. So what I say about Trump didn't have a Venezuela foreign policy. He had a Florida electoral strategy that used Venezuela. So it's very convenient to a lot of people to say Venezuela is socialist because they can make political hay out of it. That doesn't mean it's true.
Right. So let's talk. One thing I saw in your book that I did not really know was that the level of repression, political repression, in Venezuela actually markedly increased under Maduro. I guess that we let Chavez off the hook a little bit, though it had begun under him. But you describe a scene in your book where there are black uniformed elements of something called FAES, right?
Mm-hmm.
FAES, does that mean Forces Armadas Especiales? Is that what
it's like the special forces, they call it.
Special forces created by Maduro, which the way you depict them, they sound like a click, half a click away from death squads.
They are. They're less than half a click away. I mean, it's very similar to the situation with Duterte in the Philippines. So the crime has always been a big problem that the Chavista government never really knew what to do with. And there was a lot of time when they there were what we could call alliances, where it was sort of allowed to just,
right.
This was going on in the slums. But what I'm trying to say is that so Maduro comes in and crime is out of hand. And so he does a couple of things. He first creates these sort of special police operations, and the police go in and they swarm a slum. And at the end of the day, there's a whole bunch of dead people. And they say, oh, these people all died, resisting arrest, right, or in gunfights with the police. So that goes on for a couple of years, and then he creates a thing called the Fives, the special forces, where their symbol is the death's head, and they dress all in black, and they have the balaclavas, and they drive around in black, very intimidating with their AK-47s and their sidearms, and they become they then take on this job of going into the slums and just killing people who are suspected criminals. And on occasion, people in the slums who have gone to rallies or shown sympathy to opposition viewpoints. And then they also become used just as this intimidation force towards the middle class and the opposition in general. So it's these sort of two aspects of this kind of Duterte style anti-crime force, where, I mean, Duterte openly said, I'm going to go kill the criminals. Maduro never said that because, you know, as a socialist, you can't say that, but all sorts of things happen there where the government does it and doesn't, and pretends that it's doing something else.
Willie, let's go back. Let's rewind a little bit, because you said it in passing, and I really wanted to focus on that for a minute. Because as I said, I've read just about everything on Venezuela. I have my own views, which are pretty obvious. They're quite similar to yours. But in all the years that I've thought about this and read about this and been critical of him, of Chavez and Maduro, I never, until I read your book, and you don't say it in the book, you just depict it, is that I was reading it and I go, God, this is like Trump. This is like Trump, right? I could say why, but why don't you tell us? Yes, he was a demagogue, but there's more to it. That there's actual stuff that he did, that Chavez did, like the a lo presidente and that kind of stuff, where you say, man, this is Donald Trump.
Yeah, there's a lot of Trump-esque stuff there. They're both charismatic demagogues who were populists.
Grievance, right?
Exactly. It's about, I mean, Chavez gets elected as a disruptor candidate. You know, he's the anti-establishment candidate, and he comes in, and Chavez gets elected, and he takes office in '99. And it's interesting to note that the other politician who takes office in '99 is Putin in Russia at the end of the year. And Chavez was sort of a pioneer of this whole sort of new wave of autocrat that uses the tools of democracy to come to power, and then he undermines them. And so Chavez was very savvy with the media. He had his own TV show, and he was on TV for hours and hours and hours. He used Twitter very early on, before Obama ever did. There's one scene that I describe in the show where early on he's in this fight with the people who run PDVSA, the oil company. He's essentially trying to have more influence over the government-owned oil company, and the management is resisting. And so he goes on TV and he fires all these executives, and he does them one by one. He reads their name off a list and he says, so-and-so, you're fired. So-and-so, you're fired. And it's just like Trump on his TV show, but before Trump. So yeah, there's a lot of that too. And I mean, I suppose there's like a Berlusconi element there too, where these guys are so savvy media-wise, and they use that.
Willie, let's. I'm going to cheat a little bit.
Okay.
And suggest to our listeners, that they not only buy your book, because it's a good one, but that they Google your article written after you finished your book, which is in the Atlantic, and it's under your name, William Neuman. I forgot the title. Is it Casinos?
I don't remember, but there's casinos in it. So.
What's the bubble, and why are there casinos now? I mean, I say this for people who go to bed at night believing that Chavez and Maduro are forging a new type of society that's not capitalist. What are casinos doing there? Who are the people in them, and where are they getting their money, and what's going on with them?
Well, the real proof that that Maduro himself is not a socialist is that, you know, when you go to Venezuela now and before in Caracas, you see images in a lot of places of Salvador Allende. I was in the foreign ministry, and in the lobby, there's this giant sculpture of Allende's broken glasses, which are an iconic image from the coup. In other places, you see his picture painted on walls and such. And but in fact, what you have in Venezuela today is a very Pinochet style, Chicago Boys, classic neoliberal austerity program,
Run
which
by
Maduro,
Maduro.
put in place silently. There was never any public debate, never any discussion. The government never said, now we're doing this, now we're changing this policy. It sort of like filters out, but it's never been discussed as this kind of global package that it is. And it is probably, it must be the most extreme of these austerity packages, ever put in place in Latin America. And it's just the kind of thing that Maduro and lots of people like him, are constantly criticizing other governments about and criticizing their predecessors in Venezuela about it. And what it is severe budget cuts. The per capita government spending in Venezuela fell something like 75% over, from the 2012-14 till a year or two ago, which is extraordinary. And so it's like severe budget cuts, severe cuts to social programs, opening the door to imports, lack of regulation, privatization of all sorts of government services in the oil fields, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it's extreme. And I talked about it. One aspect of that is, in a couple of years ago, when I was writing the book and I was in Venezuela, there were no products anywhere. You would walk into the store and there was nothing to buy, and nobody had any money to buy it with. And one of the things that Maduro has done to address that problem and also hyperinflation is the country has become dollarized, where essentially the dollar, the gringo dollar, has replaced the bolivar, which is the national currency, which became worthless. And Maduro opens up the country to imports with essentially no regulation or tariffs in many cases. And so you go in Caracas, the stores are just full of any kind of product you could want to find, either bought at Costco in Miami or hams from Rome, or, from luxury items to the most sort of ordinary thing that, boxes of cornflakes from Trader Joe's peanuts, that kind of thing. And there's this bubble essentially in the middle class part of Caracas where it's just full of dollars, full of these special stores that sell this, which are to some degree reminiscent of the special stores that we used to see in Cuba back when.
Right.
But in any case, and then there's the casinos, and the casinos, I think that Maduro, Chavez essentially shut down all the casinos because he said that there was this bourgeois frivolity. And then Maduro brings them back with no real announcement about them. And there's several now operating. It's just a way for the government to scrape a little bit of money that it needs off of the populace. And you get inside, there's, high rollers with rolls full of $100 bills. And then there's also just, whoever has, here's the thing. There weren't a lot of people in them when I was there because it's still an intensely poor country after years and years of economic collapse. I think that they were probably hoping to get lots of Russian tourists to come in to go to the casinos.
Right.
But
not going to happen now. Let me just remind the folks listening that we're going to take questions. There's a couple pending, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. So we're going to move to the questions in 5 minutes or so. But I want to. So please get them in. I wanted to ask you though a couple other questions before we do that. As we've seen in the last couple of weeks with the war in Ukraine, the war against Ukraine, that the United States is playing footsie a little bit with the Venezuelans, with Maduro, perhaps paving the way to drop the oil embargo against him and start buying Venezuelan oil instead of Russian oil or whatever. Are the Venezuelans capable any longer of producing oil? You suggest that they may not be, that the oil companies basically in ruins.
Well, the oil companies in ruins, they have increased their production in the last 6 to 12 months. They're doing somewhat better now. If the US took all of the oil that Venezuela at this moment could export, it would probably cover the amount of oil that the US was getting from Russia before all of this started. It wouldn't change the price of gas at the pump because the price of gas at the pump is determined by the world price of oil.
Would that change the situation in Venezuela very much?
Well, Venezuela is still selling its oil. It's selling it at a deep discount because of the US sanctions, and it has to go through all this Michigas, where they, these ghost tankers, which are these, tankers that change their registration. They come and they fill up, and then they go out in the high sea and they switch to another tanker, and then the oil is, papered over as Malaysian oil, and then it goes to these what are called teapot refineries in China, and not the big Chinese refiners, but these little ones. And then all the money gets routed through Russia. And so the problem now that Venezuela has is that their banker is Russia, and all the money is stuck there. And the other thing is that now that Russia can't sell its oil on the world market in the way it could before, it's going to be going to a lot of the people who are buying the Venezuelan oil, and they'd rather buy from Russia because it's closer. So Venezuela may get stuck without a place to sell, or without a buyer in the same way, and also without a banker. So there's an incentive for Maduro to do that. It could, there's no chance politically in the US that they're going to lift the oil embargo at this point. What's likely to happen is that they'll tweak around the edges. They'll give Chevron, which is still operating in Venezuela, a license to receive some oil shipments in exchange for money it's owed by the government. And some tankers will start showing up in Texas.
William, I want to talk to you a little bit before we take the questions, and we'll take them in a couple of minutes. So get them in; they're coming in now. The opposition. A couple of years back, as people who pay attention to Venezuela know, there have been there's been moments where the opposition has surged into the streets, and either for elections, or to boycott an election, or to sponsor a referendum, or to try and get Chavez and then Maduro to resign. One of the things that hit me personally was there was always people who denounced the opposition, saying, "Oh, they're just like the opposition in Chile," like the opposition in Chile was, which was very right-wing, very elite against Salvador Allende, etc. I know enough about the opposition to dispute that, but what rankled me about that, without disputing the underlying issue, was that also implied that Chavez was like Salvador Allende, when in fact, as somebody who worked with Salvador Allende, I'd say Chavez was the opposite. But we won't get there. I won't go there. Talk to me about the opposition. The opposition now today seems neutered.
Well, they're a mess. There's lots of interesting things happening politically in Venezuela at the moment. But it's very true what you said. If you have a left-wing government that's repressive, well, then you're going to end up with a right-wing opposition, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the right to be in opposition and to protest. But that's really a mischaracterization. There's a lot of different elements of the opposition, especially today, and there's a big chunk of Chavismo that has defected to the opposition at this point.
Is there a left of center opposition?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of Chavista dissidents who have now joined forces, or in some way are allied with the opposition. And there was always, even what we might call the mainstream opposition, a lot of it wasn't right wing. It just, it was center, or social democratic. So it's a misconception, and it's a sort of Chavista stereotype to say, oh, these are the right wing, ultra right wing, opposing us in alliance with with Uribe in Colombia and Washington.
The CIA, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but the opposition has always been very fragmented. If Chavismo and later Maduro had problems with strategic planning, so did the opposition. They're not good long-term planners. They haven't often done the hard work of getting down and organizing. A lot of the political parties are just sort of vehicles for the leader, in a very much the charismatic way of Chavez, the caudillo, the leader, to, hopefully become president, which obviously hasn't happened for a lot of these guys. But there was an election in November in which the opposition won more than a third of the mayor's offices around the country, and they, although they only won 4 governorships out of 23, in well over half of the states, they got a total, the opposition received the majority of the votes, but because they're fractured, there were multiple candidates running, and the Chavista candidate was elected governor with under 50%. So it's actually quite fascinating, and it was a real alarm for the government to see itself do so badly, even though it happened to win in many of these states, and an alarm for the opposition, which could have, cleared the table if they had gotten on the same page. And then there's also this huge segment of the opposition, which is, the Guaido segment, which has favored boycotts of elections. And, if your message to people is stay home and do nothing, don't vote, well, it's not really a very good way. That's not a winning strategy.
Willie, we've got a bunch of questions, so let's do them. Let's kind of do them in rapid fire, and we'll see if we still have room for a couple more. If we do them quickly, we might be able to get them through all of them, and we'll see. I'm gonna Rick Nunno asks, didn't Chavez nationalize a bunch of industries from banking to telecom to energy? This is a clear sign of a socialist, no?
Well, the way I look at it is that nationalizations were a fad in Latin America in the 1970s. Mexico has a national oil company. Nobody looks at Venezuela and says, oh, there's a socialist country. All sorts of Latin American governments either nationalized countries or segments of certain industrial sectors, or created new government-owned companies to do things. And that was popular in the 70s. And then in the 80s and 90s, the opposite was popular, which was to sell all those things off. Chavez comes in and he has this sort of mentality of this sort of 60s romantic revolutionary that he thinks he is, and he repeats everything that was done back then. So yes, they did those things, but that doesn't make him a socialist.
Socialism also supposed to include a certain amount of control of industry by, the workers. I don't think we've seen that yet in this world of ours.
No,
personally.
Well, the sad thing in a lot of those industries is that the government takes over, for instance, the steel mill, and then it neuters the union, because now the revolutionary government, so-called, is the boss. And so, actually the owner, the boss, is now on the side of the workers. So the workers can't strike against the boss because, and we can't make demands. Well, that's not how it works.
Yeah. Well, we've seen this, you and I have seen this before in Cuba. Where the unions, the role of the unions is to push the workers to increase production, speed ups.
One last thing to say about that in Venezuela is that Venezuela, because the government has from an early stage controlled the oil industry, and then it was initially nationalized in the 70s, the government has always had an extremely large role in the economy, second only in the hemisphere to Cuba, but all the governments preceding Chavez had that same role in the economy. And nobody said, oh, they're socialist governments. They were allies of the US, and they were capitalists.
Also, this month, as we speak, Vladimir Putin is threatening to nationalize a bunch of industries. I don't think he's a socialist, at least not last time I looked. Jessica Lipsky asks, is there anything we can take from Venezuela's history and personalities in power that can be applied to the current situation in Ukraine? That's a tricky question. I don't think so, but you answer.
Well, yes, in a sense. Hello, Jessica. In the sense that, we can look at not so much to Ukraine, but to Russia. I mean, we can look at all the sanctions that the Trump government heaved on to Venezuela, and, sanctions elsewhere too. Sanctions don't tend to work very well. And don't get quick results. And, we've seen that Venezuela, there was, an oil ban on sales to the US that made it very difficult to sell oil, but in fact, it's continued to sell its oil. Iran's been in a similar situation. I would say that the sanctions against Russia are more extreme and probably better built than the ones against Venezuela, but I don't know if more extreme or more comprehensive. The other thing about sanctions is that, Venezuelans are strongly anti-sanction. I mean, there's a few political leaders like Guaido or Leopoldo Lopez who are in favor of sanctions, but most Venezuelans and a lot of people and leaders in the opposition are against them, and there's a tremendous amount of resentment. Maduro, from the early on said that, the economic problems in Venezuela are the fault of the United States. There's an economic war against Venezuela by the United States, which is out to get Maduro and his socialist government. And that was not true. I mean, the economy in Venezuela went down because of mistakes that Maduro made and because of the price of oil. And then Trump makes it true by heaving all these sanctions on Venezuela. Now there is an economic war, and Maduro uses that in his favor in terms of popularity and propaganda. So those things, I suppose, are things to think about as this thing unfolds with Russia and Ukraine.
Cindy Gresham asks if here's a stumper. If Maduro were miraculously removed from power and Venezuela could recover, what could they base their economy on, given that they might have nothing except oil? The oil is pretty good to have, though.
I mean,
that's liquid, so to speak.
Right. Well, if they can get it out of the ground. I mean, I think part of the problem with Venezuela is that, who knows now, but the theory was that the oil wasn't going to be really, the center of the world's economy for too many more decades, right? And Venezuela was going to get stuck with all this oil in the ground. It wasn't going to be worth what it is today. It's different now. Things they've gone down so much. People used to say that, fairly quickly with a bunch of investment, they could start producing a lot more oil. It's not clear to me now how quickly they could turn things around. But you do see countries recover. I mean, Peru, in the 90s, they came out of hyperinflation, this horrible war with the Sendero Luminoso, and then they had, a bunch of years of extremely high economic growth. Unfortunately, it wasn't equally distributed. And so
John Barlow asks a pretty cool question. The title of your book, "Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse," is that something that is that a common saying in Venezuela, or is that just something that I know one person in the book told you?
No, that comes from two places. There was somebody said that in an early interview I did when I was working on the book, and the phrase really sort of resonated with me. And then later on, I said I was doing a reading. I did a lot of reading in Venezuelan literature and novels and poetry when I was working on the book. And Rómulo Gallegos is sort of the great novelist of Venezuela in the 20th century. And I was reading one of his novels, and I found the exact same phrase spoken by one of the characters. So that caught my eye. When I was traveling around Venezuela working on the book, often I would be talking to people about the kind of hellish conditions they lived in. I remember I was speaking to a guy in Maracaibo who was, spending the night in his car or in line to buy gasoline, which he didn't know if there would be any the next day. And he was telling me how there was no water in his apartment, no cooking gas, no electricity, etc. And he says, we've hit bottom. And I said, no, you haven't, because if we could have had the same conversation 3 months ago, and you would have said you would have hit bottom, you'd be worse today. And 3 months from now, you're going to be saying the same thing, and it's going to be worse. So this idea that, and I had that sense when I was living in Venezuela from 2012 to 2016, especially as things started getting worse and worse, and the devaluation of the currency and inflation. And you would think, well, how much longer can this go on? How far down can it go? And I mean, when I got to Venezuela, the bolivar was at approximately 4 bolivars to the dollar. Today, if you take into account all the monkey business with taking zeros off the currency, it's something like 400 trillion bolivars to the dollar. Right.
Well,
and when it was 100 to the dollar, we were like, impossible. How long can this go on?
Right. Well, you write that at some point the inflation hit maybe 100,000, maybe 1,000,000%. Nobody knows. It was moving too fast. We have one question here, which I think I'm going to ask and answer for you. It says, maybe I misunderstood, but did Mr. Neuman, it's from Anonymous, suggest the U.S. orchestrated the 2002 coup? I don't think you said that.
No.
they
No.
were informed of it, or they apparently knew of it, but did not orchestrate it. Is that?
It's not entirely clear to me. I've talked to somebody who, some people say was told in a meeting with some of these guys the week before, and he says that's not what they told him. They certainly knew that the opposition was, this was happening in the midst of these huge demonstrations against Chavez.
Right.
So they were well aware of the pressures on Chavez and the desire of certain, the intention of certain people in the opposition, and especially in the business community, to try and take advantage of that and push Chavez out. But no, I don't. It's never been shown that the US orchestrated it, and it's never been convincingly shown that it was even, fully aware of what was going on.
Here's a related question from Jay Wilberforce. Has the U.S. Attempted to overthrow Maduro with covert operations?
No, with covert operations, no. Trump, comes out and says, oh, well, all our options are on the table, including the military option. It was all farce. Trump said that because he was a blowhard. I know for a fact that the Defense Department refused to do any planning for an invasion or any kind of military intervention in Venezuela during, at least 2 and maybe 3 successive defense secretaries. But there is the question. Guaido comes in, and then you have that bizarre episode with the weird pseudo invasion with this guy Goudreau in Florida, and these 2 Green Berets who get captured. There's a lawsuit by Goudreau that says that he had conversations with really obscure, low-level people connected to Pence and the White House. He names a couple of people. Nothing's been shown. Who knows? But
Joe Paluzzi asked a question saying that they did field work in both Chile and Venezuela in the early 2000s. But what Joe is saying is that much of what you're saying sounds like Chavez, referring strictly to him, was basically a Latin American caudillo, and Joe wonders why you didn't, there doesn't appear to be any reference to this in your book. I guess you don't call him a caudillo. I think you did at some point.
No, I think I may. Yes, he is a caudillo, and he's very much in the tradition of caudillos, not just in Latin America,
like
but particularly in Venezuela, like Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar is a classic. Huh?
Perón in Argentina.
Yeah,
right?
Very much so. Yeah, he's the square in that tradition.
And like Perón in Argentina, I'm assuming that Chavismo is going to be eternal, and it's going to be whatever you want it to be, just like Peronism is today in Argentina. The right,
it's quite
left,
likely.
Communists, Nazis, everybody's a Peronist, right?
Right. Yeah. I think that's quite likely.
Yeah, that's what are the prospects for real change? Mary Perez Viana, is that right? Viana writes that what will it take to get rid of Maduro? Seems like the opposition, whatever that means, never has been able to get any real movement forward. Of course, I'm going to let you off the hook and say you have no idea, but what's your guess?
Well, the opposition has, at different times, had forward movement. When they actually do go to elections, they at times have done quite well. They won a tremendous majority in the National Assembly in 2015. Unfortunately, they squandered that and really did nothing with it. And yes, they were faced with tremendous, opposition and pressure from the government. But that was an important victory for them. And even though you don't read this in the US press now, the November election was fascinating in terms of what it showed about the potential for the opposition to make gains. Now, obviously, the government is going to treat a presidential election, and there's a presidential election in 2024. It's going to treat that very differently than a bunch of mayoral elections around the country. But I also think it's quite clear that in 2018, when Maduro ran for re-election, the opposition could have easily beaten him because the country was a mess in Iraq. And Maduro very cleverly played the opposition and sort of forced them into this position where they decided to boycott. But they also did the boycott because they couldn't agree among themselves. And if they did go to elections, the candidate would have been somebody who, most of the other parties hated. And ultimately, Henry Falcone decided to run as an opposition candidate, and the rest of the opposition just destroyed him over it. And obviously, yes, the elections in Venezuela are not fair, and there are tremendous obstacles and tremendous favoritism for the government party. But even despite that, they won a majority in the National Assembly in 2015, and they won a lot of elections in last year. And so that suggests that there is a space there where something may be able to happen.
One of the opposition figures that really emerged publicly was Guaido. Was it Juan Guaido? I can't remember his name. Juan Guaido, who came out of the parliament, of the Congress, where the opposition had won a majority, and invoking some constitutional excuse or article, Guaido in early 2019 declared himself to be the real president of Venezuela. He tried to build a movement around him, or he tried to get some momentum. They had some, but there was a fiasco on when they tried to bring aid in from Colombia across the border. I don't want to go into detail about that. That's a great story, which you tell beautifully in your book, and that alone is reason to get the book. But my question to you is that since then, since April and May of 2019, Guaido has sort of disappeared. Does he have any following? Is he a force to be reckoned with, or is he just a footnote at this point?
Well, inside Venezuela, very few people outside of his circle, and a very limited circle, talk about Guaido. Most of the people have, moved on. Guaido, there's another case of a lack of planning and a lack of strategic thinking. Guaido promised instant gratification, instant change. Things are happening now. We're going to get rid of Maduro. All the refugees are going to come back. And he never delivered. And, very quickly, and there was this huge sort of outpouring of support for him, and people were out in the streets. You can't sustain that level of sort of energy. And so people burned out, and they became very disillusioned. And they basically, walked away from him. He's not talked about much inside the country, but he is talked about outside of the country. So in Washington and in Miami and perhaps in Bogota, that's where Guaido has the relevance. And he's still, I think we need to say that he's an important figure within the opposition. And if there is some kind of opposition negotiation with the government, he's an important piece of it. He seems to be wanting to, continue to monopolize his centrality. And aside from the support of the US, I think a lot of people in Venezuela would say, well, he's not central at this point. He's just one element among many in an opposition that's been changing a lot, with new parties, new leaders coming in.
We have just a couple minutes left. Stephen Goldsmith asks, while you were living there in Venezuela, did you see any kind of ground level community reforms among the citizens in the neighborhood that inspired you and could be replicable in the United States?
Well, hello, Stephen. And, one of the things that this makes me think of is that the Chavistas, they used to talk very proudly of these community councils that they created in cities and towns all across the country. And they talked about how it was, an example of, primary protagonistic democracy. And, the problem with those councils is that they became sort of party mechanisms to enforce party loyalty and project it into the community. and they didn't operate very well, and they weren't trained in how to do things well, and they weren't given a lot of money. And when they were given a lot of money, just like with everything else, some of it disappeared, some of it was poorly spent, some of it was well spent. But then I came back to New York. And actually, before, New York has community boards that operate really well and, have training, and they have, the government has budgets for them. And, it's a very similar kind of thing. And they're great ideas both here and there. It's just that here in the sort of capitalist center of the universe, they were actually allowed to function well. But yes, there's a lot. You do see a lot of, I've seen community soup kitchens. I've seen a lot of organizing on the community level. A lot of the good stuff tends to be very localized.
Willie, we hear a lot about from the pro-Chavez, pro-Maduro communities. We hear a lot about how they first Chavez and then Maduro has repeatedly been elected, that they're democratic elections, that majorities support them. We know the elections, you've said it before, the elections are less than pristine sometimes. Apart from the machinery of the elections themselves, what about popular consciousness? It was clear that Chavez started out with a lot of popular support. He probably lost some before he died in 2013. Maduro's been there now 9 years. Is he popular?
No, Maduro's not. Chavez is still the most popular politician in the country. Somebody sent me an opinion poll the other day, and Chavez's popularity was way beyond everybody else.
George Washington. George Washington.
And, I forget the numbers, but say Maduro was 12%, Guaido was 11%, everybody else was, under 15, and Chavez, I forget, it was.
But Maduro's literally under 15%?
Yeah, but it's been that way for a while. When you've lived through 8 years of economic chaos and years of hyperinflation, it's only the true believers who are still signing on.
Venezuela was always a country with deep class division. There was always a very creamy elite in Venezuela. Also had a racial aspect sometimes, and lots of poor people. But the country had its class differences. After now 20 some odd years of what's called 21st century socialism, are the class differences any better now in Venezuela, or are they actually worse?
Well, Venezuela had a tremendous amount of poverty. It also had more social mobility than a lot of other Latin American countries, I think. Now what you have, in 2012, when there was a relative prosperity there, you had the elite that you've always had, the rich and the upper middle class. And then you had a big middle class. And, that includes people who live in the slums and who live in cinder block houses who, you and I may look at them and think, oh, they're poor. But these are people who had been dirt poor before. And then as the country filled up with money, when the oil price went up, they could buy washing machines and they could take the kids out to eat and that sort of thing. And they consider themselves middle class. You had this huge expansion of the middle class. And then you had a band of very poor at the bottom. Now what's happened because of the crisis is that middle class has shrunk, and the poor and extremely poor is enormous. And then you still have that little cap at the top of the very rich who have always been there and always will be, and a smaller upper middle class. A lot of the middle class had savings in dollars, which they had to spend just to keep above water. So the difference is that the poor and extremely poor, there's many more of them today than there were in, say, 98 when Chavez was elected. And that was after, basically 2 decades of economic stagnation, but not what we've seen now, which is this sort of world historic, 80% of GDP evaporating.
In your book, you intersperse among the various chapters of the book, you intersperse a recurring chapter called Blackout. which apparently made a big impression on you because it's like 4 or 5 different times in the book we go back to the blackouts, to a couple of big ones. Why are they so important to you? Obviously they are.
Well, it was happening when I was in the country reporting on the book. And it's so symbolic of the collapse and the falling apart. But also I was looking for a way to create this sort of thread through the book, because the beginning of the book has to be, I wanted to write a book about what happened after Chavez, but I have to tell the story of Chavez and how he came there and what he came from and some of the earlier history of the country. But I wanted to push some of the present day stuff up to the front. And so that just became this way to tell this story that works as kind of a spinal column for the book throughout. Until it sort of all comes up to the present. And there was just such compelling stories about these people, a young woman who takes part in the looting during one of the blackouts and because she has no food at home, but then feels terrible about it. A woman who was a hotel manager who the hotel is destroyed, and so she's out of a job. These fascinating guys who, had been engineers for the power company and were pushed out for political reasons, even though they're all socialists and Chavistas, but they didn't get along with the general who was made the new boss. And then they're brought back in to save the thing because the people who are left, the apparatchiks who are left, they don't know how to fix the thing.
Yeah.
So they were just such kind of compelling stories that it worked. It seemed to work. I hope it works.
I have another question from Joe Paluzzi, who had worked in Venezuela, or had volunteered there, I guess. Joe says that Joe refers to the numerous healthcare clinics that were opened by Chavez, I guess, and she says that they became a point of personal and collective pride. I'm just trying to read the question. Oh, so was this a promising step towards the long goal of health for all in a poor country, or is there less to it that meets the eye?
Yeah, it was a promising step, but then there were less promising missteps. It was called Barrio Adentro. They built, I don't know, probably hundreds of these. I've been to a lot of them in all sorts of, all over the country. They were staffed with Cuban doctors. But over time, they stopped putting money into them, and you could go there and maybe there was a doctor there who would look at you, but there was nothing, there was no medicine, there was no materials. And the other thing is that this happens in parallel with something else, which is that Chavez didn't trust professionals because they weren't his people. And so he really didn't trust, educated people like doctors. They were bourgeois, they weren't, in his favor. So he essentially underfunded and defunded the public hospital system, which existed prior to him, at least many aspects of it, and then did fund this sort of low-level clinic thing. And so he was undermining one part of the health system while he's building up another. And then ultimately it just became a tragic sort of, another one of these tragic stories of, a good idea with poor execution. And what's the point of building lots of clinics and then letting them rot?
Yeah. Joe, by the way, has written in and corrected me, saying that they worked as a researcher, in Venezuela. What's the current relationship? David Bray asks if you can comment on the current relationship between Mexico's current president López Obrador, another presumed populist who we've had some encounters with, and what's relationship between Mexico and Venezuela, and then I would add Venezuela and the rest of the Latin America.
I guess that with AMLO, he's, Mexico has hosted the latest round, or did host the latest rounds of negotiations. AMLO has tried to sort of stay, I think that he pulled Mexico out of the Lima group, or didn't participate in the Lima group, which was this group of countries that was trying to sort of broker some kind of, solution to move Maduro out. So he's tried to be sort of lefty, neutral, friendly to everybody, is how I'd say it. I haven't paid that much attention to what he says about it lately, so I don't want to.
What about the rest of Latin America?
Well, Chavez used to have this oil diplomacy where he went around and he, gave cheap oil, especially to the Caribbean countries. He basically bought himself lots of votes in the Organization of American States when he needed them. And he also, he still sends, Maduro still sends oil to Cuba. And then there was this whole Chavez, talked a lot about, I forget the phrase, but just sort of trying to create this sort of alternate pole to the U.S. and Latin America, which there again is a great idea. And there were these ALBA countries, because there was this wave of leftist presidents, which is Rafael Correa and Lula and Pedro Mujica in Uruguay, and et cetera. So.
When you and I,
very different climate today.
I bet. You and I, when we've, and any other reporter or visitor who's been in Cuba and speaks to Cubans who are not very happy with their lot, what they tell you often is we'd like to get rid of the government, but we'd sure like to keep the free healthcare and the free education, which I've never fully understood because education is free in most developed countries. But in any case, it's a good point. Are there elements like that? Do you find some consensus in Venezuela among even those who are disenchanted, to say the least, with the government? They say, well, yeah, we'd like to remove, but we want to keep these good things that were...
it used to be clear that if there was going to be a non-Chavista government in Venezuela, they were going to have to continue a lot of the social programs that Chavez had started and that people liked, even though they were really badly run. And one could sort of hope that a different government would do them better. And that's what a guy like Enrique Capriles, who ran against Chavez and Maduro for president, said that he was going to do. Now it's hard to say, just because the whole country is so wrecked and none of these programs essentially function anymore. So it's hard to imagine what comes next. I would say that there's an expectation in the country. Venezuela is a country, because of oil again, where essentially, somebody in the book says, we're not citizens, we're clients, we're customers of the government, which we view as just an ATM for, us to provide us with houses or income or what have you. So I don't think that chip has changed in Venezuela. I think there is probably still a strong expectation among lots of people that the government is there to.
So I found it revealing in your book that you say that the current government in Venezuela could be conceived of as a Republican dream, because this is the state that has been drowned in a bathtub. The great Republican aspiration to destroy the administrative state seems to be unwittingly the case. Might not have been a goal, but it's a product of what the current situation in Venezuela. The state's very small, very weak.
Yeah, I don't know that I would say that weak is the right word, but yes, it's reduced. I talk about it as the state being reduced to the minimum. They've starved the beast, partly because of the U.S. sanctions, have starved the country, but also just mismanagement. And Maduro seemed to be happy the goal is always to stay in power. And so, no matter how much I have to reduce this space and whatever we're providing people, to me, the greatest example was the oil mines, which is this vast area of illegal and legal oil, gold mining in the country. It's been totally taken over by criminal gangs and Colombian rebel groups, and to some degree the army. And it's like the government has essentially outsourced the governing functions to these other groups, as long as the gold keeps coming out and some of it makes its way into the treasury and into people's pockets. So yeah, it's the state reduced to its minimum. I mean, there's no fire department, there's no water supply. People have to pick up their own garbage. I mean, and the government is willing to let this happen as long as they stay there.
Well, in fact, you described the gold mining area as kind of Mad Max. I mean, it's not only
it's horrible.
Tell us about it.
Well, it's just, I mean,
there's no state, right? There's no state there.
There's no state, and I described this one thing where essentially the miners who are there, they're paying all these kickbacks to the National Guard and the Army and to the criminal gangs. And there's this one case I described where a miner gets in this dispute with some guy who sells him a motor, and then the criminal gangs are called sindicatos, which means right. Union, because they come out of corrupt unions. And so he gets summoned to the town to what's essentially a court, where the judge is a mafioso, and he brings both sides in and he listens to their cases. They have to plead their cases, and then he makes a decision. So the government, I mean, what I say there is the mob has become the government, and the government has become the mob, because the vestiges of government, which is the National Guard, are shaking down the miners to get, what little profit they have out of them. And it's just intensely violent. And the sad thing is that, you had this country that was focused on oil, and the oil industry, at least, it was unionized. There were standards. There were, it required technical expertise. There were certain environmental controls, and that went all to hell. And in its place, you have, they've just allowed this completely Wild West mining thing to come up, which is poisons the rivers, kills the indigenous people, totally represses the workers there. It's just, it's the most ferocious kind of extractive capitalism imaginable. And it's, it's allowed to go on in what, according to Maduro, is the worker state.
Yeah. We're trying to exhaust you here, Willie. You're holding up pretty well. We'll try and do like another 5 minutes, and
okay,
in a couple of other questions, and we'll liberate you after that. I have a question, and then there's another one pending. I don't have a good feel of having not been in Venezuela since 1972, I think. I don't have a feel for what the on-the-ground civil society feels like right now. Is there a civil society? How closed or open is the society? And I guess, I don't know, at least for my sake, I'm not sure for how many others, but I guess you could use Cuba as one point on one extreme, and maybe Uruguay on the other. Where is there anything other than government media to read or listen to?
Right.
No. Are there political associations that you can join and not be in danger, etc.?
In terms of the media has been very, very strongly taken over by the government. There's very little independent media. Most of the newspapers have shut down in terms of being a physical newspaper. Some of them exist online. A lot of websites that give alternate views have been cut off, especially lately. There's very much this sort of Putin-esque thing going on there. At the same time, everybody's on, or I don't know if almost everybody's on WhatsApp. So there's all these WhatsApp groups, circulating all sorts of information. It's a very early on, it was a very connected society. So I guess what we would call the information environment is much more restricted than it was a few years ago. In terms of political organizations, you have all of these political parties that continue to operate. There are, what Maduro's done is sort of selectively thrown, certain leaders in jail. there's a lot of, I mean, especially for instance, during COVID early on, people were getting thrown in jail for reporting information about the pandemic that the government didn't like. So there are risks there, but it's not the same kind of total throttling down that you get in a place like Cuba. In that sense, it's much more sort of, I mean,
more chaotic, isn't it?
it's more chaotic. It's more Caribbean. I mean, Cuba's obviously Caribbean, but it's just more. It's not. The control is not as rigid as it is in Cuba, but it's getting worse and more concerning. And obviously, when the government needs to crack down, it goes out and it arrests people and it, you know, invents charges and keeps them in jail, etc.
I think we'll try and make this the last question. I don't know where our hosts from Powell's are, but I guess they'll appear. You describe, and I found it really an excellent description. You described some of the real problems in the economy originally came from the way that Chavez handled foreign exchange. This gets a little nerdy for some people, and I'll try and summarize it so we don't have to do a lot of exposition on it. But basically, the Chavez government nationalized the reserve of dollars, and if the Bolivar wasn't worth very much, it had an inflated price officially, and you could buy dollars from the bank if you needed to import something or you needed to travel, and you got them at a cheap rate. You got them at the official rate. You could literally buy them. I've seen this before. I saw it in Chile when there was hyperinflation. I saw it in Argentina. You could buy the dollars legitimately through the government for some reason, and then turn around and sell them on the black market and double your money or triple or quadruple your money, right? Yeah. Which was a great way to spur inflation and to create lots of pockets of corruption and undue wealth. Now they've legalized the dollars. They've dollarized the economy. Just unpack that a little bit. Where in the hell do people get the dollars that they need? Because I think you said about a half hour ago that nowadays you can find anything you want in Venezuela to buy as long as you have the dollars to buy it, which sounds like Cuba 20 years ago or Cuba today. Where do the Venezuelans get the dollars? I guess.
Well, I suppose there were always lots of dollars circulating because people would buy dollars as savings. I mean, when the inflation is so high, what people do is they're desperate to get rid of their bolivars, and so they're going out and they're buying dollars, and there's dollars around. I mean, there's a lot of remesas, a lot of, you know, relatives bring in dollars, a lot of people bring in dollars. You know, I don't really understand the mechanisms, but a lot of this illicit oil, sort of subterranean oil sales is paid to the government in dollars. And so there's lots of dollars coming in. There's some percentage of the economy that is just an illicit sort of black economy with drug trafficking. There's huge amounts of coca paste and cocaine moving from Colombia through Venezuela. There's all this, you know, illegal gold mining. Tons of money laundering. It's sort of a center for money laundering. So there's a lot of dollars just circulating. Even some of them are legitimate and some of them not. And but on the street now, what you see is dollars. It's rare to see bolivars. Everywhere you see signs where the prices are in dollars. And that's helped stabilize the economy because for whatever reason, the inflation in dollarized goods isn't as much.
But that creates some real class differences, right?
Well, yeah, but those were already there. I mean, it creates that. It also creates opportunity for people. I mean, one of these women who, you know, I write about in the book, Hilda, who lives in the slum and basically had nothing to eat for a very, you know, her family was almost destitute. Last time I saw her when I was there in November, she was working repairing refrigerators and making, you know, a couple $100 a month, which for her was extraordinary. So,
Willie, I want to thank you not only for a terrific book and a really good conversation, but for your resilience of answering about 50 questions and standing up for almost an hour and a half. Really good. I really really great talking to you. Really fun reading the book, and I do want to encourage our listeners to buy the book. And I don't. I would offer money back guarantee, but you're not giving me the money, so what? You can also buy my book as well. Thank you, Willie. Kevin, I see you're back, and
Yeah,
thanks
thank
for
you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Let me
Willie.
just say
Thanks,
thank you
Mark.
also. Thank you, Mark, for a great conversation. And thanks to Kevin and Powell's for hosting this.
Yeah, you're welcome. I did put the link in for the book in the chat, so people can check that out. Click on that link, buy the book from us. I'm also going to put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat there. Make sure you click on that. You can watch this event. It was recorded. It'll be showing up on our YouTube channel probably sometime tomorrow. If you know friends or people that missed it that you would like to show it to, please share that link as well. And Willie, this is the book right here. Things are never so bad that they can't get worse. Thank you for talking to us about this very fascinating book. Thanks, Mark, for taking part in
Thank
this
you.
as well. And for everyone at home and from everyone at Powell's, have a great night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night.